His death wasn't a business deal, it was a statement. By breaking Bumpy Johnson's most sacred rule, he didn't sign his death warrant, he carved it in stone. This is the story of the mistake that unleashed a calculated fury and cleansed a plague from the streets of Harlem. In the frigid winter of 1963, Harlem trembled, and not just from the cold. A new epidemic, more deadly than any virus, was spreading through its veins: heroin. For Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, now an elder statesman of the underworld, this drug was anathema, a poison that rotted his community from the inside out. He had established an ironclad rule: heavy drug trafficking was forbidden in his territory. It was a rule he enforced with relentless ferocity. It was in this setting that Slick Mike Davis, an ambitious and independent drug dealer who thought age had softened Bumpy, made the ultimate mistake. He didn't just sell heroin in Harlem, he sold it to the neighborhood around an elementary school, addicting teenagers and tearing the fabric of the community apart. Davis's mistake wasn't just breaking Bumpy's law, it was desecrating what Bumpy, in his twisted code, considered sacred: the innocence of children. For Bumpy, this wasn't a business infraction. It was an act of war against the future of Harlem. Harlem in the 1960s was a powder keg. The civil rights movement was exploding across the country, and Harlem was one of its epicenters. Figures like Malcolm X, who was a personal friend and protege of Bumpy, preached black nationalism and self-defense on street corners. The energy was electric, a mixture of radical hope and seething anger. Yet at the same time, heroin, known as White Horse, galloped through the streets, a tool of subjugation, as effective as any Jim Crow law. The drug was decimating a generation, creating an army of ghosts and fueling a spiral of crime and despair. Bumpy Johnson found himself in a unique and contradictory position. He was a criminal, but he also saw himself as a guardian of order and a protector of the community. He saw heroin not just as a dirty business, but as a chemical weapon being used against his people, undermining the very struggle for liberation that was happening around him. His opposition to heroin was not just moral, it was political. Bumpy Johnson's psychological figure in his later years was that of a weary yet still dangerous patriarch. He had survived gang wars, federal prisons, and countless assassination attempts. He had become a living legend, a complex icon of resistance and black power. His strategic intelligence was now tempered with historical perspective. He had seen what greed and unchecked violence could do to a community. His reputation was that of a man who could be brutally pragmatic, but who operated under a code of honor. And the main guideline of that code was the protection of Harlem. He saw the neighborhood's children as his collective responsibility. In a world that treated them as disposable, he saw himself as their unlikely guardian. Selling drugs to children was not just a crime in his eyes, it was an abomination, a sin against the spirit of Harlem and against his own sense of identity as its protector. Bumpy's moral code, always complex, became even more rigid regarding heroin. He tolerated gambling, loan sharking, even violence when necessary to maintain order. But he drew a bloody line in the sand when it came to soul-destroying drugs. He had seen firsthand the broken homes, wasted talents and lives stolen by addiction. He also understood the mafia's cynical calculation. Addicting the community was the easiest way to guarantee a perpetual revenue stream and keep the population subjugated and powerless. Slick Mike's decision to ignore Bumpy's repeated warnings and sell near a school was, therefore, the most direct and insulting challenge possible. It was a statement that profit was more important than the lives of black children, a philosophy that was anathema to everything Bumpy, at his best, stood for. Bumpy's response wouldn't be about territory or money, it would be about purging a disease. Bumpy's strategy for dealing with the heroin problem was multifaceted. He used his influence to fund rehabilitation clinics and support community groups battling addiction. He pressured his mafia contacts to keep the White Horse out of their neighborhoods, and when diplomacy and philanthropy failed, he resorted to his own form of justice. Slick Mike Davis was a test for this policy. He was a charismatic and successful drug dealer who was building his own small organization, and his blatant disobedience was a direct challenge to Bumpy's authority. If Bumpy couldn't stop Davis, other dealers would be emboldened, and the dam he had built against the tide of heroin would break. Bumpy's strategy, therefore, needed to be twofold. He needed to eliminate Davis, and he needed to do it in a way that would serve as an unforgettable warning to anyone thinking of following in his footsteps. Bumpy's reputation as an enemy of heroin was well known, but Slick Mike, in his arrogance, believed it was a facade. He saw Bumpy as a hypocritical old man, a gangster who pocketed the clean profits of gambling while demonizing the more lucrative drug trade. He didn't believe Bumpy would risk starting a bloody war over a moral issue. Davis underestimated the depth of Bumpy's conviction on the matter. He didn't understand that, for Bumpy, the fight against heroin was personal. It was a fight for the soul of his kingdom and for his own legacy. He wanted to be remembered not just as a gangster, but as a man who defended Harlem. Davis's decision to sell to children transformed the issue from an underworld political dispute into a personal crusade for Bumpy Johnson. And there was nothing more dangerous than a Bumpy Johnson on a crusade. Slick, Mike Davis's fatal mistake was blasphemous greed. He not only broke Bumpy's rule, but he did so in the most offensive way possible, choosing the territory around PS 92 Elementary School as his main sales point. He calculated that the police rarely patrolled the area, and that the children were easy targets to become little runners and eventually customers. It was an act of calculated depravity, placing profit above any vestige of human decency. He underestimated the depth of Bumpy's code, believing that, in the end, it all came down to money. He didn't realize that, for Bumpy, there were lines that could never be crossed. Selling poison to children was the most sacred of those lines. Davis didn't see the cold fury his act aroused in the old king, a fury that wouldn't be satiated until his existence and influence were completely eradicated from the face of Harlem. The trap set for Davis was a street justice show. Bumpy knew that simply killing Davis wasn't enough. The message needed to be public, visceral, and unforgettable. He wanted the community itself to witness the consequences of poisoning its children. Bumpy orchestrated a scenario. He had one of his men, pretending to be a desperate addict, set up a large purchase meeting with Davis. The chosen location was an abandoned playground, late at night. The setting was desolate, rusty swings creaking in the wind, a broken carousel, the darkness broken only by the dim light of a distant street lamp. It was a symbol of what Davis was doing to Harlem's childhood. Davis, sensing a large profit, arrived with two of his men, feeling secure in his arrogance. The tension wasn't one of imminent confrontation, but of ritual. The playground wasn't a point of sale, it was an altar of sacrifice. The confrontation was brief and brutal. When Davis opened the suitcase to show the heroin, the lights of several cars suddenly flashed, flooding the playground with blinding light. From the shadows emerged not only Bumpy's enforcers, but also figures from the community, pastors, shop owners, fathers and mothers, whose children had been touched by Davis's plague. Bumpy had summoned a jury. Davis and his men stood paralyzed, blinded by the light and the shock. The irreversibility of the situation was sealed not by a weapon, but by the look of contempt on the faces of the community members. Bumpy Johnson then emerged from the shadows, walking slowly toward Davis. He didn't shout. His voice was low but laden with the weight of a sentence. "You brought poison to our children," Bumpy said. "You sold their souls for a few dollars. Tonight, the community has come to collect the debt." Davis's underestimation was his downfall. He believed the Harlem community was either too intimidated or too apathetic to react. He failed to understand that Bumpy's influence extended beyond the underworld. Bumpy could mobilize the streets, both saints and sinners, when the well-being of the community was at stake. Bumpy's trap wasn't just to catch Davis, but to judge him before the very people he had wronged. It was an act of political genius, transforming an underworld execution into an act of community justice. Davis expected to face rival gangsters, not the disappointed and furious faces of his neighbors. This moral condemnation, even before any physical violence, was what broke his spirit. He was utterly isolated, condemned not only by a crime kingpin but by an entire people. Davis's mistake was thinking that Bumpy's Harlem was just a criminal organization. He didn't see that it was a complex ecosystem, with Bumpy at its center, connected to all parts. The trap in the playground was proof of that. By bringing the community to witness it, Bumpy legitimized his action. He wasn't acting like a tyrant, but as the arm of the popular will. The setting of the abandoned playground, a graveyard of lost innocence, was the perfect backdrop for this moral drama. The tension was unbearable, the silence of the crowd more threatening than any scream. Davis realized too late that he had made a mistake not only against a gangster, but against the very idea of Harlem, and that was an unforgivable offense. The turning point came when Bumpy, standing before slick Mike Davis, pulled a packet of heroin from the suitcase and opened it, letting the white powder fly into the wind. "This is what you sell," Bumpy said, his voice echoing in the silence. "Wind and death." Then he turned to the silent crowd and spoke, not like a gangster, but like a leader. "This man is not one of us. He is a disease. And when you have a disease, you cut it before it kills the body." With a nod, Bumpy assumed complete control. He gave the order, and his men seized Davis and his henchmen. There was no further trial. The sentence had already been pronounced by the presence of those silent witnesses. Bumpy's power was fully revealed. He not only controlled the streets, he controlled the moral narrative of his community. The direct consequence of Davis's mistake was death. But it wasn't a quick or silent death. Bumpy wanted it to be a message. Davis and his men were beaten right there in the playground in front of the crowd. And then Bumpy did the unthinkable. He forced Davis to ingest a massive overdose of his own heroin. The consequence was poetic and brutal. He would die from the same poison he sold. The symbolic consequence was the purification of the playground. After the bodies were removed, Bumpy ordered his men to clean the place and in the following days financed the playground's renovation, installing new swings and painting the equipment. The place was rededicated to the community, a symbol that the space had been reclaimed from the forces of darkness. The message that cemented Bumpy's untouchability was the nature of the punishment. By forcing Davis to overdose, Bumpy created an indelible image, an urban legend that would be told for years. The message to all drug dealers was clear. If you sell this filth in Harlem, you'll get what's coming to you. The striking symbol was the renovated playground. It became a silent memorial and a warning. It was a testament to Bumpy's dual role, the destroyer and the builder. He was the man who could bring death one night and new life the next. This cemented his image not only as a crime kingpin, but as an elemental force in Harlem, an agent of balance, however brutal his methods were. He became the personification of harsh but necessary justice in a lawless age. The historical impact of that event was a temporary yet profoundly significant reduction in heroin trafficking in Harlem. It wasn't a symbolic or superficial retreat, but a real shake-up in the structure of the local drug trade. The traffickers were terrified, not only by the fate of slick Mike Davis, but by what that act represented. The story of the forced overdose spread rapidly, acquiring the contours of an urban legend and serving as an impossible-to-ignore warning. Many packed their belongings and left the neighborhood in silence. Others remained, but began to act with extreme caution, reducing operations, changing routes, and avoiding any form of visibility. For the first time in a long time, fear ceased to be imposed solely by the police or rival gangs, and began to emanate from a single, centralized, and unpredictable authority. The immediate effect was a contraction of the heroin trade, which, although not definitive, offered a rare interval of relief to a suffocated community. Harlem felt, albeit briefly, that someone had interrupted the automatic cycle of destruction that seemed impossible to contain. For the community, Bumpy Johnson's act was deeply controversial. Many were shocked by the brutality of the method, unable to morally justify such an extreme punishment. However, an equally large segment of the population saw the episode through a different lens. For mothers and fathers who watched their children languish in the streets, consumed by heroin, Bumpy emerged as a reluctant hero, perhaps the only man with real power and willingness to act where the state failed. The police were perceived as absent, indifferent, or corrupt, while heroin continued to destroy entire families. In this vacuum of authority, Bumpy occupied an almost paradoxical role, that of a violent protector. He was neither simply loved nor absolutely hated. He was feared, respected, and in many cases silently grateful. The event solidified his image as a complex paternal figure, someone willing to bear the moral weight of decisions that others avoided. He became, for many, the last bastion before total collapse, an imperfect guardian in a world without clear alternatives. The story of the downfall of Slick Mike Davis quickly became a grim lesson about the consequences of violating a king's moral code. Davis saw only immediate profit. For him, Harlem was a marketplace, not a community. This limited view was his greatest mistake. He underestimated the depth of Bumpy Johnson's personal commitment to the neighborhood he ruled. In Bumpy's kingdom, some transgressions surpassed all others. Heroin wasn't just another illegal product. It was a poison that corroded the very foundation of the society he claimed to protect. Davis learned, in the most brutal way possible, that certain crimes were considered worse than murder. His punishment was neither random nor impulsive. It was exemplary, calculated to generate a lasting psychological impact. The goal wasn't just to eliminate a drug dealer, but to redefine the limits of what is acceptable. The message was clear. Anyone who insisted on profiting from the destruction of the community would face consequences that went beyond the traditional rules of the underworld. This story doesn't romanticize Bumpy Johnson's violence, but contextualizes it within a scenario of collective despair. What occurred wasn't the act of an idealized vigilante, but the action of a man cornered by extreme circumstances. Bumpy used desperate tools to confront a desperate problem. The heroin represented an existential threat to the balance of Harlem, something that slowly eroded everything he had built. In this context, his response was less about cruelty and more about restraint. Still, the moral ambiguity remains. The act raises uncomfortable questions about how far someone can go in the name of collective protection. Was it justice or tyranny? Protection or terror? The answer depends on the observer's point of view and the suffering they carry. The story makes it clear that the line between hero and villain is rarely objective. It is drawn by history, by circumstances, and by consequences, not by absolute principles. Bumpy became a symbol of this ambiguity, a man permanently situated between salvation and damnation. To truly understand Bumpy Johnson's reign, it's necessary to understand the demons he faced, both external and internal. Rival gangs, foreign mafias, and the police were constant threats, but none compared to the devastating impact of heroin. It silently destroyed the community's future, corroding entire generations without firing a single shot. By confronting this demon so dramatically, Bumpy reaffirmed his sovereignty in the most extreme way possible. He made it clear that his power wasn't limited to the criminal economy, but extended to defining what was tolerable in his territory. This episode helped solidify his image as an absolute ruler, feared and paradoxically necessary. The story of Slick Mike Davis remains a grim warning that in Bumpy Johnson's world, the true limit wasn't the law, but the survival of the community. And when that survival was threatened, there was no room for hesitation.